So welcome everybody to our sixth CIRC seminar of the semester, the second to last. And before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to advertise for that final seminar next Monday. That will be in this room at the same time, 4 p.m. It's Dr. Verarut Kantrachat, who will be speaking about development and middle-income countries with special reference to Thailand. Dr. Verarut is from an important institute for development studies in Tokyo called GRIPS. But today we're very pleased that Maitrii Aung-Thwin has joined us from Singapore. And we just had some coffee in Festival Walk, which happens to be owned by the Singaporean government. So we're pleased that he didn't have to go that far away from Singapore, even while in Hong Kong. Many of you will know him, his research, his many well-known books on Myanmar. I'll call it Myanmar today. But for those of you who don't, he's widely published both on Myanmar and Southeast Asia generally, including A History of Myanmar Since Ancient Times, that's 2013, Return of the Galong King, that's 2011, and in A New History of Southeast Asia, 2010 rather. He's a trustee of the Burma Studies Foundation in the US, a former president of the Burma Studies Group, and a member of the board of directors of the Association of Asian Studies in the US as well as being on the editorial board of the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, and he's associate professor of Myanmar Southeast Asian History in the Department of History at the National University of Singapore, which I might add is at the moment the top-ranked university in Asia. So
it pleases them very much.
Anyway, we're very happy you could join us today, and we look forward to your talk.
Thanks very much, Mark. I would like to formally thank Mark and also Tom Patton for having me here. I mean, it's a real, I was just saying, coming up through the halls, it's so nice to be in a different environment and to be able to see other students from a different university and to be able to speak to a different audience about a topic that I'm actually very interested in really developing. And you've caught me at a fantastic time, not only because you're taking me away from final exams and other sorts of activities that I think are very much close to what's happening over here, but there's been some recent developments in my own research that I'm going to bring in to this talk, and so this is in a sense fresh off the press. And there's some, I mean, a couple nights ago I heard some exciting news which I'll tell you about in regard to the topic. But I'm also very glad to be speaking to the students here. Are there many, how many of you are graduate students actually? Postgraduate students, I should say. Okay, so most are undergraduate students. The topic that I'm going to be sharing with you today is really both a study of how history is made, as much as it is also about a critique of that process. And so for me, this was much a study, and it became part of a book project, a 3-book project actually, that I'm trying to embark on. And I'm very interested in the process of how is knowledge made, and how is history made, and what are the circumstances in which history is produced. And so I'll be focusing on this particular event in Myanmar history, the Situating Rebellion. And it will be a comment not only on the story behind the making of that history, but it's also a story about Southeast Asian studies, and about how we have thought about what is Burma, what is Myanmar, and what is Southeast Asia. I've prepared a lot of pictures, so bear with me on that. But I think at 4 o'clock, if you haven't had your coffee, 4 o'clock time, I think we need something to keep us awake and quite alive. Now, I've talked about this, the topic is it's entitled In the Shadow of the King, and there's a double play on that. Because I'll be talking about not only the figure, the central figure of Seasan, who has been known to have imagined himself a returned king of colonial Burma, who was fighting against the British, but it's also going to be in reference to the monarchy as well. And I'll talk to you about how that plays out in the context of 1930s British Burma. But perhaps there's a need to talk about basically the context in which we'll be focusing on. The subject of this rebellion is very much part of a broader colonial encounter between, you might say, British imperialism and the Kingdom of Burma. For those of you who are not familiar with that history, in the 19th century, Burma was annexed by the British over 3 wars, the Anglo-Burmese Wars. And the picture you see here is by Court painter about the last king's abdication as he got shipped off to Ratnagiri in India. After the Anglo-Burmese Wars in the 19th century and the dismantling of the monarchy, which was a central institution of Burmese history, there was a long period of rebellions, a pacification period for about 20 to 25 years. And elites and members of the court started up these small uprisings in resistance to the annexation. And this is an important context because this period of resistance was said by British colonial historians to have finally finished by about the 1900s or so. And so pacification was a particular period. It ended. There were no more rebellions. And this is why the Seasan rebellion, which I'm going to be focusing on today, was so important, because it surprised everybody. It surprised the colonial authorities that they thought they had pacified the country. And so I'll be talking about this in the context of this broader encounter. And finally, we have to think about the dismantling of the monarchy and its central place in Burmese history. And when I say this, when I talk about being in the shadow of the king, the loss of the monarchy is said by many scholars to have played a very important role in how we imagine Burmese history and Burmese studies. A lot of scholars have talked about the loss of the monarchy being very important to the decline in the religion. And this became part of the rallying call for many resistance fighters and rebels and nationalists, that without the monarchy, you don't have a central patron for the taking care of the Sangha, or the Buddhist institutions. The king is kind of like the Pope in a sense, in Catholic, Christendom. He makes sure that the religion is pure. He donates resources to the religious organizations in order for its upkeep. But if you cut the king out, who's going to be the supporter? And recent studies now that have come out recently said, well, lay people come in, and other sorts of organizations have come in to help protect it. But psychologically, the loss of the king from a religious standpoint was very significant because you no longer had a sort of protector in the conventional view, the protector of the world, because most people are Buddhists, and if you don't have a chance to donate and give merit and so forth, this will affect your own trajectory for a better rebirth and so on. But at a different perspective, it also created a political vacuum as well. Because even as the king was a patron of the Sangha, he was also a patron of elites and other notables. And without the king, that type of organizational structure also became distressed. There's a sense of cultural loss. The monarchy was also very much a patron of the arts and jobs and so on, and building of temples and other types of edifices that were important both to the religion and also towards society. And so losing the monarchy, losing was a core institution, and it's created in many historians and scholars of Myanmar a psychological trauma that was unable to recover. And later on, scholars as well as officials on the ground during the colonial period would also see that Burmese reformers, Burmese rebels, as we will talk about, would understand reform only through this model of a king returning to help save the future of the country. That they could only see reform and improvement in their lives through the restoration of the monarchy. This was a very traditionalist type of argument, so I'm breaking it down very simply. But what's interesting, and we can talk about this perhaps during discussion, is that in looking at contemporary times, people have also interpreted the actions of government as also playing the role of the monarchy, whether it's generals donating to temples, or at least their use of this type of model of just like the king, so too are we creating a sense of legitimacy. So kingship and the role of the king is something that might be a category through which you could look at both pre-colonial and modern history, the ways in which the idea of the king has been very much present. We would move on, I think, to the making of British Burma, which is, in many ways, a whole lecture in itself. But I'll just do this for the sake of background. That, oops, Mark, I forgot to do my timer. That's what's important to remember when we're thinking about setting up the stage for this rebellion was that the province of Burma, if you're not familiar with it, the Burma was annexed and connected to British India, so it became very much a part of its administrative apparatus. The British came in the early 19th century and already started to develop the lower delta area, which is where the rebellion occurs. And it became a very important agricultural sector they drained for rice. They drained the swamps and were able to make it into one of the most productive rice production centers in the world. Migration of people from Upper Myanmar would come down for better jobs, and this is important because this fits into the Seasan narrative that I'll be talking about later. It was also the establishment of the civil service and the legal system, so there was obviously a colonial apparatus that developed during this time. And it was very much a reconfiguring of Burmese society, and I'll give you an example that when I talk about the Village Act, which had several manifestations in 1889, 1887, and 1907. You can see here how Myanmar, basically the Kingdom of Burma is now divided into a different type of social organization. The Burma Village Act is interesting just as an example of this reorganization of Burmese society, because it basically delineated how communities would be formed. And the magistrates who were assigned could actually say, well, the community begins here and it ends here. So boundaries were set up. You had new headmen who were appointed to run these new villages and townships and so on that were not necessarily connected to the local community. And so they would switch headmen and put them and assign them to different places. And this becomes very important because it shows a disconnect between what used to be hereditary leaders with the village community. So now you had strangers running, in a sense, the villages. And so it comes to no surprise that when the rebellion first erupts, guess who gets killed? It's a lot of these village headmen who were not necessarily part of these earlier communities. So headmen were also invested with the powers that you can actually read through the Village Act for enhanced policing, judicial power, and surveillance. And so they were supposed to report to the district commissioners if any new people wander into the village or if there's any sort of criminal activities and so forth. So they became very much a top-down type of representative, kind of like the heads of department in Singapore. They become representative not of the departments, they become representatives of the deanery. So in a similar way, these headmen are representatives or working for the colonial government, not for the village people who they are supposed to represent. The period, what are we talking about in the 1930s? Huge economic depression, there's a drop in rice prices, there's a lot of strain, there's a lot of distressed communities. We can talk about this context a little more, but this is obviously a very important time. A lot of cultivators and a lot of rice producers are not able to maintain their lives. People are getting poor, getting bankrupt, and so on. So there's a big economic crisis going on. A separation issue also that's happening at this time politically. People don't talk about this very much. There was a push to separate India from Burma. There were proponents of it, and there were opponents of it. A lot of the nationalists were worried about being separated from India, and this becomes part of the rebellion rhetoric as well. They were worried about being separated from India because India was going to go through some progressive reforms where we had greater self-government. The Burmese were thinking if they disconnect from India, they're not going to enjoy some of those reforms. And so a lot of the nationalists, including people associated with this rebellion, were saying, we want to be anti-separation. We want to go alongside with India because we are on the same trajectory. But of course what would happen later with the rebellion was that this would suggest to colonial officials, or at least would suggest to officials in London, that maybe Burma and India were on different trajectories. This is also an important time of nationalist movements. You have the General Council of Burmese Associations and the General Council of Sangha Sameji, which is basically the religious branch of the nationalist movement, and these political monks, who were very much involved in going into the countryside and talking about reform through Buddhist terms and vocabulary. So they were a very interesting example of combining, you might say at the time, modern political organizational strategies, but with much more local terms and vocabularies. So Ultima was one of these. He was considered very radical to the British. He was a very important figure in that type of movement. Now, when we talk about the rebellion itself, it was in an area called Tharawadi, which you can see here is in a section of lower Burma. It was about 3.5 hours from Yangon, and it's a very interesting history. If you look in one of the gazetteers, these gazetteers were these pamphlets that were written by colonial officials to give information about each district. They had their own histories. The history of Tharawadi was always known to be like a haven for criminals. In fact, it was almost as if the soil was tarnished, so that it actually bred these criminal folks who were either gullible, or considered gullible, or restless, inherently disruptive. And so they had stories, in fact, connected. I won't have time to get into them, but stories connected to this long history of a criminalized landscape, of a criminalized topography. I mean, if you're familiar with old Robin Hood, it's like Sherwood Forest, being a cesspool for robbers and bandits and so on. And it was so those from Tharawadi were considered to be almost what was called genetically inclined towards uprisings. And in fact, there were uprisings that had occurred in this particular area. This model that was based in Tharawadi would soon be extended, though, to all of Burma. So it started off as a local characteristic. It would soon be talked about later on when the rebellion emerged as being a trait of most peasant Burmese. So it's a very interesting expansion of this idea. Now, I'll be talking very quickly in terms of these types of themes: situating rebellion, the ways it's been interpreted, and then I'll get into the story of my own research, which starts here. Actually, how was the rebellion formed? Essentially what I'm doing, if you want to take away from anything, is actually this. I'm basically looking at the ways in which history was formed from the colonial law, from a trial, essentially, at Seasan, to the archives, and eventually how it became part of history. So I'm looking at the making of history and the development of the Seasan narrative. And this, of course, comes from a particular type of training and particular types of questions that were important to me when I first began this. We can talk about that training later, perhaps in the discussion center, but in a way, I'm looking at the ways in which this history was created through the different contexts in which the sources were made. That very question also comes out of historical moment as well. Because at Michigan, where I was doing my PhD, we were reading a lot of stuff that actually had similar types of questions about how do we know what we know? This is a basic question that I'm still trying to sort of figure out. How do we know what we know about this particular history? So this has been the driving force behind this particular research project. These are the basic objectives of the paper, which I'm looking basically here for today's paper, the role of colonial law in the historical construction of the Seasan Rebellion. But what I'll also be sort of hinting at with my new research are these two aspects here. How did counterinsurgency law provide the framework and the terms through which rebellion was understood, and how did the rebellion narrative hide or obfuscate the differences amongst rebels? This is a story that I'm engaged in right now. I'll be giving you some of the sort of fun stories that I'm starting to detect out of the sources. So on the one hand, I'll be looking at the ways in which law created a particular historical understanding of this rebellion, but I'm also going to be looking at the ways in which law hid stories about rebels as well. So what's the story itself? What's the story of the rebellion? Well, basically, in the end of almost around Christmas time, 22nd of December, there was an outbreak in Tharawadi district, and the early reports that came in. This came in 5 days later. This is not the earliest report, but we even have the telegrams that say the first sort of announcements. they said there's an outbreak, that something's happening in Tharawadi. Forestry official was attacked, and 2 headmen were killed. Again, you see right away, why are the headmen being killed? A mob attacked a police patrol, which retreated and brought several men back. So another larger platoon came out. They were also attacked, this time by like 500 soldiers, and so they had to retreat. And they quickly called in the troops from nearby Rangoon. So this 15th Infantry Division from the Punjabis were sent in. When the troops went in, they encountered at a nearby village called Pashwejo a massive encampment of rebels. And these rebels basically swarmed out of the forests right into machine guns. And people were saying, what in the world are they doing? They were running with dahs, with knives, and someone reported that they heard a gong, and there was these flags and so forth. And they were running straight into a bunch of bullets without any fear of getting killed and so forth. Of course, people got killed. When you run into a Lewis machine gun, it does something to the body, I suppose. But what's interesting, if any of you have read the beginning of Nagara by Clifford Geertz, he starts off the story the same way, that the Dutch were coming up into a kingdom, basically, and these people ran right into the line of bullets without any fear for their lives. Here, as we will talk about, they felt that they were invulnerable. And there's a reason why they thought so. Well, when they attacked this encampment, they were able to kill 2 leaders. They cut some trophies. This probably was the gong they might have heard. Some tattooing implements. You can see these are probably right here. And some supplies were captured. They reported local uprising, nothing to worry about. This is where it is today. You can't really see this as a light. Maybe can we adjust that light? Because you can sort of see this is Pashwejo village actually. You can sort of see the green of the. Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah. You can see this is supposedly where the troops were coming out, and nearby is a temple that's now a monastery that's now dedicated to Seasan. You can't see the writing in there, but it basically says Galon Tupanaka Galona Raja, which is something he was attributed to have signed as in one of his oaths. He was known as Galuna Raja, which means in a sense Galon King or Garuda King, and this figure of the Garuda it becomes an important symbol for the rebellion, which I'll get into in a second. After that battle in Pashwejo, troops went into this place called Alantau, which is a mountain hideaway where apparently his headquarters or his palace was located. They went up there, they secured the palace. This is an actual picture of it from 1965 or so. And from these early reports, this is where we get mention of the term Min Laung. And the name Seasan is also mentioned in that same report. But what is the Min Laung and what is Seasan? Here's just a map to show where Alantau here. So this is Alantau. This is Tharawadi district. Here's a train line. Here's Pashwejo. Here's Tharawadi. It's interesting because if you compare these rebellions to other places, they always seem to be happening around railways. And I think there's a reason for this also. It's a material symbol of the colonial state, or its encroachment also. They were trying to bomb some of these railway tracks too, but we'll get into that later. Min and Laung. Min king, Laung incipient, or king to be, if you translate it that way. What's interesting though is that the British translate Min Laung as pretender. It's a pretender king. One who's pretending to be king but's really not. Right? So there's a sense of legitimacy being tied to this term. I've asked Tom and I've asked some other scholars, when is the earliest time have you seen this term Min Laung? And no one seems to have seen it before the 19th century. I'm a little bit suspicious about this whole term and its story, but that for now, it's just we can take it down as meaning a pretender king, an illegitimate king who's trying to say, or if in old Kipling's, he's like the man who would be king, the type of guy who just is an upstart, And this Min Laung model, basically, that came in this report here, that was in 1931, basically said, from time to time, because the Burmese are inherently restless and gullible and willing to get very excitable is a term they use a lot. They will often arise a person who will imagine himself king, essentially. And he outlines Carey here in this book called Hints on the Guidance of Civil Officers in the Event of Outbreak or of Disturbances in Burma. It was produced in 1914, but then reprinted in 1931, not coincidentally, to demonstrate, to explain what was going on. This guy named Se San was just one of these other guys who from time to time need to rebel, and then they'll disappear and go off, into the ground. Se San himself, from the information that we know, was born in 1824. This is his descendants. He came from a family of basket weavers and bamboo mat makers. He was married, had 2 kids, moved to Moulmein in the south, remarries, has other kids. The history that I'm telling here, though, is a very sketchy one. We're not really sure about who he really is. This story was reconstructed in 1965. This is several decades later. There's a history to this biography, but we'll move on to see who else he was. This is probably the most famous picture of him. I mean, he's supposed to come from a very poor background, but he moved south, and in the south to Lower Burma. This is why I talked about Lower Burma and the migration of people to the south to find better jobs. That's part of his official story as well. He became known as being an indigenous healer, a Sese'a. He was also had a criminal element already because he was running illegal lotteries, apparently. But then here comes the funny thing. He joins the GCBA, this major nationalist organization, and then becomes a subcommittee member to investigate grievances in the rural areas. And in fact, he goes in there and makes a report, apparently, in the late 20s. So, and he starts to form what's called the Untitled, which are kind of like village associations or defense associations. I mean, I guess one way you might think about him is like a patriotic organization to protect the interests of the villagers, to provide a different set of conduit for talking about grievances other than the headman. So it becomes like a parallel type of government almost. And so he sets these Untitled, or you might call them like a local militia, in a sense. And he belonged to a very radical branch of this GCBA, this General Council of Burmese Associations. So from a basket weaving family, he becomes suddenly a part of the very modern political organization. And that story, I have so many questions about it because it just doesn't make sense to me. Not to mention the fact that he's in this wonderful portrait here, just a very famous picture of him, where he looks very well off on a carpet, nice clothing and everything. And then what peasant leader is going to have a portrait taken of him? This is for the elites, And so I've been wondering about the whole role of this picture too, and whether, what do we know about this guy actually? So this is a question that still I'm having trouble trying to come to terms with. Maybe you guys will have some ideas about how to think about this. But the rebellion does spread. It spreads, as we see, from Tharawadi all the way up into Thayetmyo, and actually goes into the Shan states later on. There's outbreaks of violence in neighboring villages. There's, again, attacks on headmen and government installations like railways, police stations, post offices. The government initially is caught by surprise, but they attribute it to the secret planning of the GCBA and these secret village associations that Se San set up. So you have the spread of the rebellion occurring. So it's obviously not just a local uprising, and it's obviously not something that's just going to go away. It continues on, and they realize they're in trouble. They need to get some support from India in terms of more troops, and at the same time, they need to react, as all bureaucrats have to react to, provide some explanation for it, as if they knew it was coming all along. And this is, in fact, what the tone of their reports happened. This is probably the most interesting aspect in terms of Southeast Asian students, is what I call the rebellion ethnology. It's a set of characteristics and features that are connected to Burmese culture that were very much used to define what rebellion was in British Burma. The rebels who were attacking the machine guns, who were invulnerable, they were doing so because they were adorned with tattoos that were supposed to have protected them from bullets or from harm. They were said to have used amulets and spells and so on to ensure this invulnerability. But what's interesting is this whole term Galon King, or this Garuda King. Galon and Garuda are the same thing. Now, Garuda is the sort of celestial Hindu being that it not only carries Vishnu around, so it's the vehicle of Vishnu, but it is also a story about this antagonistic rivalry between the Garuda and the Naga. The Naga is it's like a dragon or snake, for that matter. And there's kind of like the fox and the hound type of dichotomy, and they're always supposed to be internal enemies. The tattoo of the Garuda defeating the Naga here, not necessarily this picture, but a symbol representing that, was said to represent, not only protect the wearers from bullets, but it was also known to represent the very idea of what rebellion was. The Garudas or the Golon were associated with the Burmese, and the Naga the British. And so this argument though comes out in the trial of Se San, and we'll get to that in a little bit later. But so the very symbol, this ancient symbol, it became to symbolize rebellion and resistance in Burma. The British responded perhaps typically. They assigned more troops by the Reagan authorities. They sought emergency powers because they could only have troops working for the government for about 10 days or so. That's what they were allotted. But they see the rebellion spreading. You got Garudas running around and attacking villages and so on. So they needed to have these troops in order to restore order. But they weren't going to be allowed to do that by London or by New Delhi. So they need to create special legislation to say, hey, we have special circumstances here that we need these troops. But they didn't want to declare martial law, because if they declared martial law, they would lose power. The civilian authorities would have to defer to the military authorities. So they wanted to create a situation where they could use the troops, but then maintain civil authority. So they did it through special rebellion ordinances, which became special acts. And this special legislation becomes very important because it creates not only a commissioner that becomes the head guy in handling rebellion affairs, but it creates these special rebellion tribunals that will be used to try captured rebels. And it's from out of this context that the historical record emerges, which later scholars would use. And I'm going to be, in a sense, reconstructing that whole story. So rebellion law was established by these ordinances, and it wasn't done very easily. The local Burmese Legislative Council fought it tooth and nail, this passing. Because they basically said, this is a police state. He said, you can't be doing these sorts of things. And the arguments that you're using really don't jive. This is all in the Burmese legislative proceedings. But basically what happened was, even though the Burmese Legislative Council actually rejected the proposals to enact these special powers, the governor came in and had final say and said, we're enacting them. So rebellion laws were created. And just moving forward, Se San was eventually captured in August 1931 and sentenced by the special tribunal. Here's a picture where he's being led out of the jail. And according to some of the records, he was led wearing chains and so on into the courtroom because that would sort of, in a sense, convey the sort of predetermined guilt that was there. But I mean, the fact that you had a special tribunal already sort of designated to rebellion also suggested that a lot of other forces were already in place. But what's interesting is that after his, not interesting that he was executed, but what's interesting about his court case is that it became the template through which all other court cases were tried. And so all the findings from his court case were used unilaterally across the board for all the other trials, which unified the rebellion in a very coherent way. So the law and the trials had a way of unifying the whole story about the rebellion. I'm going to be showing you how that was done. The rebellion just continued all the way into 1934. Officials would say that though the official push or the official motivations for the rebellion died down, and that you just had random dacoity or banditry occurring. Overall, 1,300 rebels were killed, about 9,000 were surrendered, arrested. Many were imprisoned, and many were also transported. Transportation is a sentence that means you're just basically exiled out of the country. And a whole ton of these guys ended up in the Andaman Islands, which is one of the prisons for these types of convicts. To me, that's a fascinating story, and that's hopefully the third book, that decides what happened to these guys, after they leave the gaze of Burmese officials. What happened to the stories of these folks who get pushed away away from their their homeland? So, in summary, if we take this early event, between 1930 and 1932, you had one of the largest anti-colonial rebellions in Southeast Asia. This Minlao movement was said to wanted to have to restore the monarchy and protect Buddhism. So Seasan was said to, if you follow me, you get yourself tattooed, you make an oath to the Galons, I will rise up and become king, and we will return, Burma back to the good old days, essentially. And the rebellion ethnology, its features that were associated with the ideas and the worldviews of the rebels, would continue on into scholarship. And I'm going to be telling you how this happened. You can see here are the tattoos that were supposedly found on one of the tunics, the uniforms that they were wearing. So how did scholars interpret the rebellion, based on this foundation? Or how did writers, I should say, interpret it? Well, initial assessment by the authorities was that this was a politically motivated rebellion by extreme nationalists, essentially. Even though opposition members were talking about, no, these guys are rebelling or these guys are resisting because they're under hardship, economic hardship because of the Depression, they're saying, no, this is all political minded. And so reports like this one you see on your right really tried to push the political angle. And this, of course, was important for the civil authorities to make the case not to the Burmese, but to London and to New Delhi. But in doing so, what they did was they presented the rebellion as an undifferentiated mass, of faceless peasants who were just traditional and simplistic. This was the type of ideas that were inherent in these reports, and this continued to be repeated and repeated, and ended up becoming, in a sense, codified in a major report that would come up later. I'll tell you about that soon. There was a cultural argument as well, as I've hinted earlier, that these rebels were, as I said, gullible, superstitious, or opportunistic, like Seasan, that they saw things were in bad shape, and they would step in and try to get people to rebel because these people are by nature gullible, and they would follow anyone who would actually lead them. You mention, I'm a restored king, or I'm a returning king, they will follow him. This, of course, was a very biased perspective, and scholars reacted to it in probably predictable ways. Myanmar scholars especially tried to downplay this type of interpretation. And they said, and because they're doing nation building at the time, saying, well, this Seasan rebellion is an example of peasants coming together and, in a sense, fighting for the nation. Even though they didn't know about the nation at the time, this is representative that they were anti-colonial. And our nation comes out of a very anti-colonial background. So nationalist historians talked about the rebellion in that case, and they downplayed the superstitious part, a little bit embarrassed about it, in fact. But they said, and nostalgia for the monarchy, but said, hey, these guys were legitimate. I mean, they had a reason for doing it because of the economic problems that they were facing. But like the British, they also saw the peasantry and the participants in the rebellion as an undifferentiated mass of faceless rebels, and that these folks were also separate from the urban educated elites. And in fact, if you go to the Armed Services Museum, which is a very interesting museum, because it's one of the only places that has a sort of the modern history of the nation in it. You don't go to the National Museum for the modern history, you go to the Armed Services Museum. And there you'll find an interesting, well, at least the old one in Rangoon, you'll see a exhibit which has a sort of national trajectory of nationalist movements and so on. And you have the elite movements and the city urban movements in one place. Seasan is very separate from it. They have an exhibit for Seasan, but he's not seen as being part of that same story, and there's a reason for this. And I'm suggesting that as one of the scholars here, national scholars, Maitrii Aung, they were a little bit embarrassed by it, but they also said these guys are very important because this was the sort of popular expression of nation building. Burmese language nationalist histories as well were produced in 1965, a very famous book called Tandu Ledama Yedebon, which is official history written in 1965, also talked about this peasant struggle as being very much an important part of the forming of the nation. Post-independence foreign scholars were also looking at it in terms of nation building as well. This is the old famous Professor John Cady about the history of modern Burma. He highlighted also the economic distress and proto-nationalism, but he also wanted to examine, like all the scholars of his time, the political structure of the movement. He also looked at peasant political expressions and forms of action, but he was doing it from more of a structural perspective. He's looking at how did these organizations work. He didn't focus on the superstitions and so much, but he offered an opinion that the reason why the rebellion occurred in the way it did was because they didn't have any other options during this time. So Professor Cady also continued much of the same very narrative that both the colonial writers and the nationalist writers used. For area studies, for those in Southeast Asian studies, guys like Emmanuel Sarkeesian took a turn that was absolutely fascinating at the time. Here they wanted, instead of dismissing the superstitions, dismissing the rebellion ethnology, they embraced it as a text to understanding Southeast Asian mentalities and worldviews, especially religious ones. So they looked at and said, wait, what was regarded by British as superstitions were actually deeper cultural explanations for these actions, and that the rebellion was a response, a cultural response that reflected broader ideas of Buddhist ideas and also Buddhist millenarianism. He came up with an idea that Seasan was not just this Minlao, this pretender king, but he actually represented the Chakravartin, the universal emperor, who would prepare the way for the future Buddha. That when doing so, he suggested that peasants saw these conditions in the 1930s, this unraveling of the world, essentially. Poor economic conditions, monks not behaving, traditional hereditary relationships being disrupted. He said, for many Burmese, they saw this time as being the end of the world, just as it was prophesied in these ancient texts that talk about how the end of the world is going to come. The series of texts called the Anagata Vamsa, just the history of the future. And that's a wonderful, wonderful title, the history of the future. And in that future, a future Buddha is supposed to come to renew the world. But a king is supposed to prepare that way. And so Sarkeesian suggested that Seasan was not trying to be a pretender king. He was acting out in the way most Burmese would understand, that he was a Chakravartin. Another trajectory of scholars, revisionist ones, started to question actually this whole portrayal of traditional versus modern. Was this a modern movement or was this a traditional one? And she basically said that this is actually a modernist movement. By looking at the actual sources that were connected to the rebellion, that the use of these Wunthanua things, this was a modern political organizational strategy of integrating the urban reformers with rural ones. She said this wasn't the action of traditional-minded folks who were interested in Chakravartins. This was a modernist movement with folks who were rational, who were very much aware of the types of new strategies that were required for political mobilization. And she was also one of the first to actually use Burmese sources by looking at a lot of the Burmese language, newspapers, and writings of the time. She said this whole rebellion was the product of this more modern form of political strategy. So what were the broad trends we can say from this overview of the scholarship? Well, all of them accepted the facts and the shape of the narrative. All they were focusing on was the interpretation. What were the causes? What were the motivations? How do we look at the superstitions? Do we look at them as positively or negatively? I mean, it's essentially what they were doing. They all accepted the facts were important, and they were looking at them usually through a binary perspective. Were they superstitious or were they rational? Were they modern or were they traditional? Was the argument politically motivated or economically motivated? Were they were they unified or were they not, and so on? And what this focus on interpretation did is that they were relying on an unproblematized archival record. In other words, they weren't looking at the sources. They weren't questioning the sources. But that whole approach, of course, is a very much a late 20th and 21st century idea. So you can't blame them for that. But if you're a new scholar and so forth, you got to say the earlier scholars are problematic in some ways, right? So you have to create your own space. But this is part of this question alone about unproblematizing the archival record is something that's a product of the late 20th century that I was trained in. So this is the reason why I'm approaching it in this way. What were the shortcomings? Well, I've already mentioned some of these shortcomings, that they ignored the circumstances in which the evidence from these legal trials were produced, or the records. They neglected the processes that shaped the very making of the story. So if the narrative, the story, what happened to Se Hassan, is your subject, how was this subject, the story, made? No one bothered to ask that question. It avoids confronting the categories. We talk about things in terms of superstition, ethnology, and so on. No one even categorized what we mean by resistance or what we mean by superstition, these sorts of things. And of course, it also didn't think about the connections between the actors, the administrators, the ethnographers, the police, and also scholars and historians who would write later. So my work tries to bring all these things together. And in doing so, I focus mainly on, I started off with this official report that everyone used to begin their study, which was the official report that was written in 1934. It was like basically saying, rebellion's done, case closed, here's the official report. Everyone started off their study using this report. But when I took a look at it, I was thinking, wait a minute, what's the content in here? The content actually was all the summaries of the trials. And it was just the prosecution side of the story. So I said, wait a minute, number one, there are obviously sources that come up before this document. Number two, this document is based on findings from court cases, and only the prosecution's arguments are coming from it. As I said, this is already shaking the foundation upon which most of scholarship is based on. So that became my eureka moment. I said, okay, I got to look and see who made this report, how was it formed. So this is how I got into this story. And I'll tell you a little bit about that if we have more time later. Do I only have 9 minutes left?
Actually, but go ahead.
Okay, actually done, 45 minutes, is it?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so what eventually I do is I went back, I'll just summarize it for you then. I don't know, actually I'll tell the story, what had happened. I stumbled on this by accident. I was asked to focus in a graduate module, probably this size, focus on a colonial official, a scholar official, someone who was in between, who started off as a colonial official who became a scholar. And I wanted to, because these guys were very important in the production of knowledge that became the foundation for Southeast Asian studies, or for Southeast Asian history. I didn't want to focus on a colonial official, I wanted to focus on a Burmese official. So I wanted to focus on this guy I knew, this guy named Bama, who would become the future premier of the country under the Japanese. He was an important leader. But in his early career, he was a lawyer. And he was the lawyer who represented this rebel named Se Hassan. And at the time, I was interested in reading about folks who were caught in between, mixed people, mixed Eurasians, folks of 2 different backgrounds, Anglophile Southeast Asians, who on the outside look Southeast Asian, on the inside they're British. Partly because I was interested in my grandmother, because she was one of them. She knew Jane Austen before she knew any Burmese writer, and so I was interested in sort of connecting with that. So I said, how did this anglicized Burmese lawyer represent this very traditional Burmese peasant? Did he go through any internal conflict or any sort of issues, as he represented? I said, how can I find out his case? So I basically was trying to find out how he defended Se Hassan. And this was the only source that I could find that had legal sources in it. But then I realized upon finding out that this source that was the basis for all of the history that had been written about Se Hassan, both English language and Burmese language, because even the Burmese language focused on this report as well. I said, wait a minute, this entire story is based on just the prosecution side of the story. So I didn't have a really good paper to turn in to follow the assignments, but I gave this presentation instead. And I said, well, wait a minute, actually. What you have here is a history that is on very shaky evidential foundations. And so the paper presentation this is the beginning of the paper that I'm supposed to be presenting today. This is how I got into it. And essentially what I found out in looking at the trial, that even the prosecution's arguments were very flawed in how they produced this guy that they called Se San. That I found out that the evidence that they used to create the facts that we now hold as history was all based on the prosecution's arguments that were extremely problematic, that any good lawyer, or hopefully any good historian, could unpack. But yet, that story made it out of the trial, made it into the archives, and made it into essentially this report here, upon which later historians talked about it. So even today, when we talk about Se San and the rebellion that was connected to it, he and the rebellion are seen as being an official moment, an important moment in Southeast Asian history and also Southeast Asian studies. And yet, that whole story is really on shaky ground. And so what I do in my research is I've been showing how this is problematic and where do we need to go from here. Now, if I could quickly end, Mark, with where it is going from here. In one section, I've problematized the narrative, the story, and how it was made. Now what I'm focusing on, which is what I'm hoping to produce for your working paper series, is the stories of all the other rebels. Because in Se San, you have all these rebels are fighting for him, but no one actually knows anything about these guys. But the trial records of them still exist. And we're talking about at least 4,000 to 5,000 documents existing right now on these trials. I just found out another trough of them in July, another 1,000 of them, going all the way to 1937. So the trials are still going on at that time. And in those records, you even find appeals for clemency, because they're on death row, basically. And they're asking, saying, listen, I need to be let off here. And so you're hearing their voices, seeing them, it's still in legal context, you're still seeing their voices. So these are the voices I want to try to bring out. What's also interesting, what you also see, is that there are tensions and rivalries that you can pull out of these trials as well that have nothing to do with rebellion. You've got defendants who are being put on trial for being a rebel, and you got prosecution witnesses testifying against them about their activities. And in defense, they're saying, the only reason why this guy is testifying against me, is because we had a grievance last week on the soccer pitch. It has come up in the legal records. Or in a more scandalous example, which I'm going to be writing about, the reason why he's testifying against me here is because I hooked up with his wife, last week. So what we're seeing now is local stories, local issues that have nothing to the rebellion, but they're being captured in these legal sources. And what this reveals is, A, you can find local village life going on within the context of rebellion, but you also have a very fundamental process going on, which is very important for Southeast Asianists. It's a process of localization here. These guys are using this rebellion tribunals for their competition wins with their neighbors. And you're seeing it time and time again that these guys are prosecution witnesses are using to get back, this guy owed me money. That's why he's testifying against me. And so these are the stories I want to bring out, to address not only the shadow of the Se San rebellion that's obscured their stories, but also to show that you have, I'm really addressing, what is peasant life, going on, and what's peasant life in the 1930s like. And what's interesting, it has nothing to do with rebellion. It has actually to do with these rivalries and these contests that are going on at a very hard time in colonial Burma. And as I mentioned earlier, the third project is about finding out what happened to those that were punished and got sent away. What's their story? Where do they end up? Are there any people left alive to hear the story? Just to end up with some nice pictures. Guys, I was so excited about this because, I forgot to tell you, I'm still very excited. Last Friday, I was just telling Tom, I got an email from my graduate student. He said, I think you might be interested in this. And he sent me this website that talked about Myanmar film. And it said, it was about the history of Myanmar film. And he said in the 1930s, they had all these documentaries that were being produced by the founder of Myanmar film. There was a film that apparently, a film that was made covering the entire trial. I've never seen any reference to this anywhere else. And I almost fell out of my chair, when I saw this. And unfortunately, of course, this film apparently burned down in 1950. Not the film didn't burn down, but the house that stored it burned down in the 1950s. What was originally happening was the British wanted this film company to film it, so it could be a pro-imperialism type of documentary. But these guys were sneaky. They wanted to use it for nationalist purposes, and so so people saw this trial throughout Burma in the movie theaters, and this is probably why the trial was so sensational. The thing I'm hoping and praying is that if this was sanctioned or if this was censored by the colonial government, there might be a copy somewhere, and then we could probably get a better sense of what the story is. So not only did I find fortuitously in July a whole new trough of sources, but I just got word about this film just over the weekend. So I'm very pleased to have been in Hong Kong to have heard that news and be able to share it for you. I purposely put Saya San in shadow here, but he's very much alive even today. The presentation obviously had 50 slides, and so I actually go through some of the pictures and so on. But I wanted to fast forward it to this issue, where it's going now. So I'm going depth. I'm going the story of the rebels that have been talked about, but I'm also going in breadth. I'm comparing it to the Chittagong army raid case in the 1930s. And I stumbled on this by accident because I found references to this case in the Burma Rebellion files. I'm like, okay, there's the alarm. Why are there Bengalis being talked about in this whole rebellion thing? I said, I can't figure out why. I mean, there was one, they were trying to say that the situation was similar, so this is why special legislation had to be enacted to get these special powers that create the tribunals and so on. But I said, there's so much description here, I can't figure out what's going on. Then I find out that this leader of this Bengal army raid case is a guy named Surya Sen. And I'm thinking, that's odd. The name sounds very familiar. Because Saya San I've never taken to the name Saya San. It doesn't sound very Burmese, frankly. Saya is obviously a term meaning teacher, and so, but to have Saya San is very awkward. And my suspicion is that there is a lot of comparison going on between the British authorities in Bengal and that in Burma. And I have a suspicion that the narratives are very much linked. So I'm going with breadth to compare the two rebellions and the trials, because this guy was also caught and put on trial. Even the trials, the way the trial arguments were made up, are also very similar. I can say about it a little later. Both fall on the supposed diary of both Saya San and Surya Sen. And for both cases, they need a handwriting expert to come in to actually say, is this the handwriting of the defendant? And it's based on that testimony of that forensic specialist, who in the case of Saya San didn't know Burmese, that the entire rebellion narrative is based on these special diaries. Both diaries are also not known to be found. No one's ever seen them. We only have transcripts of it. Saya San is in memory. Ne Win interviewed old Galong guys in 1965. This is one of the monasteries that is associated with Saya San. You can see there's a statue of him. Saya San statues are popping up everywhere. This one you can't see in Dharawati. I had to drive up the car, shine the headlights on it because it was nighttime. I missed it entirely, and you can only see a little image there of him because of the headlights. But I should get a better image. This one is near Moulmein. It's very new. This one's in Mugwe, holding hand in hand with one of the Thakin, the socialist Thakins. So I mean, the peasant leader is very much connected to socialist history and socialist ideology, obviously. So this is some of the memories that are associated with him. And with that, I'll leave it off and welcome your discussion and questions.
Thank you very much. Open the floor.
Ian.
Great, thanks very much. Really fascinating. I'll ask you two quick questions on the stuff you sped over at the end there.
Yeah. Do you want me to put it up so you?
No, one brief comment. The first is the very last point you make. What did the Thakins make of him? I mean, the whole Dobama, all of that stuff, the urban.
Yeah.
What did they want to ally themselves with this rebellion, or was it also embarrassing because it was superstitious and peasant-based and all that? And the second thing is I saw Michael Adas very briefly.
Yes.
But I was wondering why he hadn't come when you were talking about Patricia Herbert and other people. So kind of what
the role,
what
where he fits in it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the brief comment is that my own feeling is that Pretender is an entirely appropriate translation from In Laung. If you think of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite Rebellion and all these things in British history, the pretension of throne there's nothing artificial about it. They are just making a claim, and that's precisely what Seah San was doing. So, I think you're reading something into the use of that word as the translation, which was never there. I think the British are aware of say 300 or 400 years of English of British history. So
it's a reflection of British
and
ideas of the situation.
Yeah, and there's nothing that suggests that there's anything illegitimate, that this is a kind of artificial or plastic king or anything. It's just it's almost like an acknowledged claimant to the throne. They really do have a real claim.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I'll start with the elite response. Yeah, it's very interesting. The King and the GCBA, most of the elites who, especially those urban elites who were part of the part either by the Burma's Legislative Council or nationalist groups, tended to disassociate with the peasant rebellion. With that said, there were factions within the GCBA that were somewhat more extreme than the others. So the Sothang GCBA, these different associations and subgroups were usually following one person. So it's very much mirrored the social structure of Burma, very patron-client. So they would name their faction according to their leader. So Sothang was much more radical. These guys were all for it. In fact, they were implicated in it as well. But even in the Burma's Legislative Council reports and in the newspapers, they would be saying that we sympathize with them, but this is not the way to do it. So the more moderate reformers had a very predictable response. Other nationalists who were on more of the radical bent were very sympathetic and said, well, they know, like a guy named Usal, who was famously known for having been behind Aung San's assassination. He was a representative from Tharwadi, and it's like these guys are being driven, to resistance and rebellion because of the poor economic conditions. So there was a mixed response by elites. I can give you a sort of anecdotal one from a certain group, from my grandmother's sort of circle. They had a masquerade party around this time, but the fact that they're going to masquerade parties should tell you something about their community, actually. And she's correct. So she represented a group that was hired to put them down. Put down the rebellion down. So the Karens were very much as a minority, were tied very closely with the British. And so they had a masquerade party. And she tells me, she told me when she had a memory of it, was somebody walked in suddenly, dressed clearly as Seah San. He had done tattoos on the legs, and had rolled up the longi, tied it up so that it looked like he could run faster, in the jungles. And he had the gombao, and he had a shotgun and so forth. And everyone looked at him very quietly. Was it perhaps in bad taste? Perhaps it'd be like dressing up as ISIS or something right now at a costume party. Well, anyway, he ended up winning the contest for the costume, but that was her memory of it. I asked her brother, my uncle Raymond, my dad's uncle Raymond, what was your memory of Seah San? And he was younger. He said, there was a bunch of idiots running around, with DAS, and we just had to put them all in jail and so forth. So it depends really on who you asked at the time. But for the nationalists, there was variation within the nationalist group, and they responded differently. Now, Addis, I loved Addis's work. Addis had two works, actually, that focused on Seah San. One was the Burma Delta, which was his dissertation, which he looked at the economic formations of a frontier economy. And he talks about the rebellion. And about 13 to 15 years later, he wrote a book called Prophets of Rebellion, which takes not only the Seah San rebellion, but looks at other rebellions globally and compares them and argues that Seah San, like these other leaders, were more than just pretender kings, were more than just Chakravartins. They were actually seen as being millenarian figures. And so he's kind of like Sarkisians. In fact, he based his work on Sarkisians, the old man I had put in the picture there, who first talked about it. But what was different about him was that he said this is not just particular to Burma or Southeast Asia. This is actually a global phenomenon that is a response to anti-colonialism. And so that's where he sort of fits into the story. Again, based on the same narrative, on the same facts and the same features. But what he did, of course, was he brought this new worldview, or new lens through which we could interpret rebellion and resistance and as a phenomenon in Asian studies. He said, this is not only talking about Burma or Southeast Asia, we can now bring these regional studies and compare it globally. And this, of course, is, Addis is famous for being a world historian, actually, later on in his work. So that's where Addis fits. And now, yeah, I think your point on the pretender, because it's part of the English experience, isn't it? And with resistance and rebellion and so forth.
The dictionary would give you several different definitions for pretender. One of them would be precise. It doesn't mean pretend to pretend.
I see. I think. But what's also interesting for me is the question that Tom and I were talking about earlier was, when does this actually term even come up? Is this term Min Laung something that's historically part of, say, Burmese history or Burmese linguistics, or is this something that comes up in the context of, say, pacification, in the context of this turmoil at the time? So a lot of these terms we're still trying to figure out, and so anyway, that's what I also meant to emphasize. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. It's actually very interesting. My question, in fact, perhaps you'll probably answer part of it, is, obviously, we understand this rebellion, from history, and that's very much from the British colonial perspective, and you try to, reinterpret it through a Burmese, narrative, or at least, from a different, perspective. My question is, what were the feelings with other ethnic minorities in Burma at that time? Were they sympathetic with the rebellion, and if so, what happened to them? Were they part of it?
Yeah, good question. I'll clarify the first part, though. I'm not actually interpreting the rebellion, but what I'm actually looking at is a story about how it's made. Okay. And so I'm not actually getting involved in the causes and so forth, which is something that I actually hope to do. The question about what did it mean to the other ethnic groups? I mean, that's a fantastic question. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of those who were associated with the British, like my family and so on, didn't have much, didn't resonate with them. To put it mildly, because they saw them as country, bumpkins, who are irrational. They bought into the narrative about them. But what's interesting to me is the fact that now some of these same ethnic groups are trying to rekindle Seasan, as part of their own regional histories. I showed you one picture there that's actually in what's essentially Mon territory, and they're sort of bringing Seasan into that picture because Seasan was supposed to have come down into Momain area, before he led the rebellion. And the Mon seem to be that Mon area, even though it has Burmese living there. It's being part of their history as well. And what's interesting too is that it's going to be connected to tourism, too. So but in terms of your question of the time, how were they feeling? I guess again, as I would say to Ina, it depends on who you ask, because the Seasan rebellion was connected to rebellions in the Shan states, and so some Shan would probably be very sympathetic to it, but others who were more aligned with the colonial administration would not be. Others saw it not even in the terms that were being described by the British. This is what I'm finding now. They saw completely in local terms. You have stories, terrible stories of Burmese killing Karen, Burmese killing Kachin in these villages. There's nothing about Min Laung, there's nothing about Chakravartins and millenarian guys or Galones and Rajas and all this other stuff. It's just inter-ethnic tension and warfare and rivalry that's happening at this time. So what it suggests to me is that we also need to be thinking about this period, not just in terms of the rebellion narrative, but as a period of great instability. And that some people were not seeing it in the ways in which outsiders were seeing it, or in this case officials and so on, but they were seeing it in very local terms, and this comes out in the cases. Just horrible stories, of Burmese coming in, taking them out, and the British were reporting this in the legal terms, in ethnic terms as well. It's like, these guys were killing the Kachin once again, or once again they're killing the Karen, and so they were very much aware of these inter-ethnic group tensions, And so, yeah, it was and I'm just starting to get wind of this type of perspective that, had nothing to do with even these official narratives, that this was just local villagers against local villagers, or one group against another. Sometimes within families, like this whole messing around with the other one's wife and so forth. There's another sister involved. I mean, this is even inter-family rivalry going on, but yet all encompassed on the special tribunals. So this is an interesting site or focus to bring up some of these stories and ethnic rivals that you brought up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Tom, you have something?
Yeah, but I just love the oral historical accounts that you give from your family.
Yeah.
Have you been able to track down any of the Sayasan's, descendants?
Most of them are dead, obviously in the 30s. But the kids, there's some people I haven't met them, but actually the people that I've tracked down are some of the folks who were involved who are descendants of those who were involved in the case. U Ba U, the future president, second president of the country, was one of the tribunal members. He was on the flip side. Bamal was the lawyer on the defense side. Both descendants are living in Singapore right now. What's his name? One of the assistants to Sir Arthur Eder, who was the main prosecutor, was being assisted by a Shan guy. His son is one of the most famous lawyers who trained all the judges in Singapore. He's living in Singapore as well, and he told me some stories, especially the part about bringing in Sayasan with the chains and all that. There are recordings, which I haven't seen or heard, of the Galon members, and these are supposedly in the military archives, Defense Military Historical Research Archives. Patricia Herbert has had access to these. I haven't had access to these that give some accounts, and I suspect that they're going to reveal the variances within this event that really challenge the coherency in which it's been treated, which is my main argument at the moment. That instead of having this unified, coherent movement, you actually had a lot of variances, a lot of differences. Folks were not necessarily connected to Sayasan at all. Some didn't know who he was, even before or after he was caught. And that there were a lot of local issues and dynamics going on at this particular time. So the oral history, that's very much, I think, a part of it. But just to add one more thing in terms of now what's happening today, with all these accusations of land grabbing and so on, it's appeared in the papers recently that some activists and local townsfolk are saying we should have another Sayasan rebellion in connection as a response to the influx of people just the government grabbing land or companies grabbing land, that we need to have another Sayasan rebellion, which is interesting for how it's remembered and how it's being used as a way of responding to certain political conditions. So I'm thinking the Minlang model continues, as a lens through which resistance can be understood. And this is just coming out now. What I couldn't believe is that, wow, they want Sayasan Rebellion to come out without really understanding what Sayasan Rebellion might mean, but it's very important that they take it that way, that it's being remembered in a particular way and being applied to even contemporary Myanmar right now. Yeah, Mark.
Thanks very much for that. I just, as a non-specialist in Myanmar, but somebody interested in Southeast Asian history, I just wanted to try to figure out a little bit more about what your sort of aims are in this narrative deconstruction.
Yeah.
And if you'll indulge me for a second, I was thinking of the German tradition of Quellenkritik. You critique your sources. But in the German 19th century tradition, of course, you had them particularly focusing on the history of Christianity and trying to discover the historical Jesus, and they, of course, worked hard to get rid of a lot of the illusions people had, but ultimately tried to come up with something they thought was approximating the truth better than some of the. So, they had this project of destroying or questioning the narrative in order to create a quote, more accurate one. The second idea I had was the American historian Bernard Bailyn wrote a famous essay several decades ago, arguing that U.S. history went through a series of stages. It started out highly nationalistic, then you had in the early 20th century sort of a radical revisionist, Charles Beard and people like that, questioning the founding fathers as sort of materialist, greedy oligarchs. And then he argued, very self-servingly, by the 1950s, historians have become more objective. And they sort of figured out that there's no need to play up the nationalism or go over to an extreme form of critique, that one could be more objective. Clearly that's not what you're doing either. Then I saw the brief reference you had to Ray Aleto, that sort of history from below, and you sort of suggested that happens in Burmese history as well, that people say, you know, we have this national narrative, but there's this alternative perspective from below. So at this point, the event is sort of disappearing. I mean, you know, you're beginning to raise questions, how much of a unified rebellion was it anyway? I guess my question is, so what is left?
Yeah.
What remains?
Yeah.
And, you know, based on your considered judgment of this critical, you look at the sources, what was going on?
Yeah. I'll answer it in two ways. First, I'll talk about my intellectual influences, which will answer that aspect, and then the second part of it, which will talk about what remains. I was at Michigan at a time when post-colonial studies was really in its boom. We had folks like Nicholas Dirks and Ann Stoller there who were really questioning the colonial connections to what we know, basically. And it was part of this whole post-colonial predicament, that a lot of the histories and understandings that we had about our region or our subjects and so forth were actually very much connected to the context that emerged out of colonialism. And so that was one sort of intellectual encounter that I had, I suppose, and without even realizing it at the time. I didn't realize that all this stuff written on it when I was actually just sort of stumbled on this report. So I realized later that actually it applied to this stuff, and so maybe through osmosis that it was actually affecting me. So that's why you got to attend your lectures and attend your classes, right? I mean, it actually affects you in interesting ways. It also actually intersected very closely to subaltern studies, which again can also be seen underneath post-colonial studies. And if you all remember that subaltern studies was a school of thought that went to rethink the ways in which resistance movements, especially in the South Asian context, needed to be reinterpreted because nationalist and colonial scholars had tried to appropriate these movements for their own political and interpretive aims. And so it intersected with some of these ideas as well. I didn't start off there. I just found out that it was connected much later. And the issues methodologically that were connected essentially to Foucault and power and genealogy. How is the certain levels of knowledge? So that if knowledge has sediments, like he talks about the archaeology of knowledge, when we find a source, what is the context in which we find it? Like an archaeological site, you find a piece of artifact, you say, well, how does the ground around it tell us about that piece of artifact? I was doing the same thing for the sources, so that was also very influential to me as well. Now with Ray Aleto's work, I was actually inspired originally to not write this type of history. I was inserted into Ray Aleto's work about recovering the peasant consciousness and so forth, recovering Southeast Asian worldviews and so forth. But then when I found out that a lot of these interpretations were based on the colonial facts and evidence, then I started to ask a different question. And so, in fact, I was not really acting in a very historical, as what a traditional historian might be doing. I wasn't trying to actually say what happened. I was actually looking at the history of the knowledge. And this is partly, I think, connected to really the reflexive turn in the 80s and 90s, about, which came out of literary and cultural studies, which asked the question, how do we know what we know? Our categories, our knowledge, our narratives. It came out of literature, it came out of anthropology. I was influenced a lot by Talal Asad, about his connections between anthropology and colonialism, and the implications of anthropologists as being part of the colonial project. I started thinking about the same sort of things in relation to this narrative. Now, what does remain, though? So that's my intellectual approach, is why I approached it in the way it did. I also want to be inclusive. I didn't want to say you guys are wrong and these guys were right and so forth. I also wanted to be very inclusive and say these are the reasons why they wrote in the way they wrote, as opposed to saying this guy's right and this guy was wrong. I wanted to say they wrote for particular reasons, because it also tells us something about the intellectual context. And I hope that the book that came out would be read by graduate students actually too, so they say, well, how, when we think about history, how is history made? But what does remain, and I think what remains is what I'm sort of getting into now, is that we never really understood what was going on, at the time, especially the peasant lives, the people that we just lump as a category of peasants, the folks that were sort of swept up into these tribunals and were used as witnesses, prosecution witnesses, approval witnesses, the folks that were imprisoned and so forth. What was going on with those stories? What's happened is Sean has been used as a figure of resistance and so forth, but he's also a figure that has obfuscated. Who has really hidden the stories of other peasants. His narrative is the one who's heard. No one else's stories have been heard in the 1930s, and I think this is what remains. And at the same time, I think Ian Brown's work, who has worked on the economic situation of the country at the time, aptly addresses the economic foundations for the rebellion. But I also think that those were some motivations for some rebels, and maybe not for others. So what remains, I think, are the lives of these stories, and to sort of keep the rebellion narrative and framework in mind, but switch the perspective and put these lives of these peasants. So I'm, in fact, I thought about this last night. I'm returning to peasant studies. Peasant studies was a big push, and this is what made Jim Scott famous. And he focused on the Situating Rebellion as moral economy of the peasant. He compared it to the Ngay Tin uprisings, right, in Vietnam. He was very much in the midst of an argument with, are they rational parents or are they parents? Are they rational parents? Rational peasants or irrational peasants? And I think I'm going to be returning to this whole story of what is the peasant, and it's been a Burmese context. How have we constructed, how have we understood what peasants are, and how will this study reveal a particular moment in peasant lives? I think that's what remains for me in the second book, which I'm working on now. And then the story about convicts later, the story, and there's another category that we can look at. Who were these rebel convicts and what were their experiences? So it's trying to rescue these stories, in a sense, from the rebellion narrative. If Prasanjit Dwar is saying we're rescuing history from the nation, I'm trying to rescue these particular stories from resistance narratives that may unintentionally silence them in ways that we're still sort of discovering now. Thank you all for having me, being such great hosts and great listeners.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and discussion.